Well, welcome back. So last time we talked about how we would go about reading in some data sets. We had some examples, and we said that it would be a good idea if you kept all of your data inside of a data folder in a project that's related to this class or related to the project that you're working on. But here I want to talk about what it is about tidy data. What does that mean? And why do we use Tibbles to do that? So here's an example, and this is lifted straight from the textbook R for Data Science. And so if we look at this, this is tuberculosis cases for Afghanistan, Brazil, and China in 2 years, 99 and 2000. And we see over here the rates, okay? Now, technically speaking, this is all the information. This would be all the information that we need. We have the count divided by the total population and so forth. However, while a human can make some sense of this, a computer is going to struggle. Okay. So take a minute and talk to your neighbor about what's going on in this data and particularly why these values are in quotes. Okay, so that's the exercises for right now. I'm going to pause here. All right, so I'm hoping that you had a fruitful discussion with your neighbors or with your partners, and you have an idea of what's going on with this column. So let's see if we can make this data set a little bit better. So from Wickham's paper, this is 2014 paper about what tidy data is. It's got these three rules. And technically speaking, if you have two of the three rules, the other rule it must come as a necessary conclusion of the first two. So if the rules are each variable must have its own column, each observation must have its own row, and each value must have its own cell. So if you have two of these three, you automatically get the third. So if you have each value must have its own cell and each observation must have its own row, then necessarily each feature has to have its own column, or each variable has to have its own column. And so here's kind of like the sketch of this, if you will, that if you make sure all of the features belong in their own column, which let's be honest, we've been talking about this for a little while now, the idea that with Tibbles, we have to have features be atomic, i.e., everything in that column has to be the same class. And so we're already sort of used to the idea of putting measurements in their own columns, that we don't have a single column that has a whole bunch of measurements all mixed in together. Okay. And we also already talked about the idea that rows of a Tibble, rows of this rectangular non-atomic data, i.e. a Tibble, they are their own samples, their own observations. And so when you have that happen, that means that the cells themselves of this table contain unique values. So the step that we're going to take for this tuberculosis case data is we're really just going to take this rate column and we're going to split it in two because it's actually two different measurements. There is the incidence column and there's the population column. So that's where we have here. We're splitting this up, and now this data is tidy. So every single measurement, so we've got the measure, what country is it, when is it, how many cases were there, how big was the population at that time. And then this is Afghanistan in 1999 has this record. So each experimental unit at the time has its own record. Okay, because Afghanistan in 1999 is a different country than Afghanistan in 2000, and so therefore it needs to have its own record. And similarly, we've got the countries are in one column, what year it is its own column, the cases in its own column, the population is in its own column. And so you can see that each entry or each cell of this table has its own value, its own unique value in it. Okay. So tidy data, this is, I'm going to, basically, I'm just going to read this. There's a couple of benefits for working with tidy data. And so the first is mathematical consistency. Most of you may not be super familiar with the idea of linear algebra or advanced linear algebra like matrix algebra, but the concepts that we have pieces of information in rows and pieces of information in columns. And those are almost sacred, if you will. That is an idea that goes back in mathematics a long, long time. So when computer scientists were thinking about designing the first computers and working through categorizing and organizing data in computers, most computer architecture for data was kind of designed with that in the back of their heads, because computer scientists had been trained in mathematics, and so they knew, like, okay, this is kind of how in mathematics we think about data. So that those ideas of rectangular data just kind of translated from theoretical mathematics into the structure that computers use to store data and that we can interact with data. The next point, this is one of my favorites because it allows me to be lazy. And lazy programmers often are, well, I'm speaking, I'm outing myself. Being a lazy programmer sometimes means that you're a good programmer. You want to write something, you don't want to reinvent the wheel, and if you can find something that works, you want to keep using it. So if you have your data in the same structure, if all of your data sets are in the same type of structure, in the same format, then you don't have to go write new code to perform statistical analyses on each new data set. Okay. So imagine if, in order to do like a t-test for data from the ACS, you had to completely write an entire module from scratch in SAS, for instance, in order to do the t-test for the ACS. But the data for, I don't know, the data for the ABCD data set, ABCD study, was in a totally different format. And so whenever you went to go do the t-test, you had to write an entirely new set of analysis scripts from top to bottom to get the data to where you want it to be. That would be really, really tedious. But if you have the ability to say, okay, all of my statistical machinery, like for instance, the idea, and a t-test is kind of a dumb example, but linear regression, for instance, linear regression requires matrix inversion, and it requires you to calculate a lot of matrix multiplication. It requires you to do a hat matrix, a whole bunch of things. Imagine you had to write the Fortran code or the C++ code in order to do that, specific to each problem that you were using, because every single time each data set had its own structure and its own format. That would be exhausting. But instead, if you just say, okay, let's keep a traditional standard approach to data formatting, and that is all of the samples go on the rows, all of the features go on the columns. We go back to this idea in mathematics of an n by p matrix. Then suddenly these linear algebra libraries that have already been written in Fortran and already been written in C++, they just work. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to start over from scratch to perform something basically linear regression. Um, this third point is R specific, because R is a vectorized language. But storing measurements in the columns of a tibble means that R treats the data set as a vector of atomic vectors, as a vector of a list of atomic vectors, which means that we get a whole bunch of performance increases. So there's math. Math is good with this. Lazy programmers are happy with this, and R itself happy with this. So there's three reasons to use tidy data. There's not a whole lot of great reasons to not use tidy data. I'll just be honest with you. Some of the times where you won't use quote unquote tidy data, statistical genetics and genomics, a lot of times it's actually a transposed tidy data where the samples become the columns and the measurements become the features. Other cases where, like if you have a REDCap database, for instance, a lot of times when you're storing the data, it may not necessarily, like if you're doing longitudinal data, the longitudinal data may not be tidy, but a lot of times you're going to end up turning it into some form of tidy data to either do modeling or graphics. So longitudinal data is one of those cases where tidy doesn't always make sense, but most of the time it's good to just have like a default that all of your data be tidy, unless you have an exception come up with either like statistical genetics or genomics data or some longitudinal data. But I would say that even then, to keep everything else as tidy as you possibly can. Okay, so before we move on to, let's see, so there's an aside on the pipe operator. I want to take some time here, and I promised you, I said, okay, if you remember in my computer, there is a CSV file for the Miami-Dade and Broward zip codes. This is where you do this. So I want you to get some practice, and I want you to write these files. So we have them as .txt files. But if you remember, I was saying earlier that a lot of like the standard data formats and standard rectangular data formats across the entire world is going to be comma separated value format, so .csv file. So use this code and go through these data sets and make sure that you write them as .csv files. So, and then check them. Open up the CSV files. See if you can open them up in Excel and make sure that they have the data that they're supposed to have. And then finally, the other question would be, or the last exercise is for next class. For the class on data manipulation with dplyr, we're going to need the NYC Flights 13 package. So go ahead and install that. Alrighty then, I'm going to wrap up this video for now, and I'm going to come back and talk to you about this thing called the pipe operator. So see you soon.